You're listening to Speaking of Language, a podcast recorded at the Language Resource Center at Cornell University. I'm Dan Gable, Technology Manager for the LRC. Each week, we explore a topic related to language pedagogy and second language acquisition. This week, on Speaking of Language, one recent project at the Language Resource Center has been to archive a substantial number of vintage language-related tapes, many of which were recorded at Cornell. Dick Feldman, director of the Language Resource Center, talks about the process of dealing with this rare material.
So, in talking with the Cornell Library, they agreed with me that this was reasonable and legitimate intellectual material produced according to norms of the time and representing teaching and intellectual practice of the time. And just for those reasons should be preserved, even though we wouldn't teach language exactly that way now.
Right.
But as you say, even though, as you say, some of the ideas of drill and dialogue that were introduced then and were unknown before then, it should be said, continue today. So there isn't a complete break. There's a continuity of development from those times until today, and that's another reason why they should be preserved.
Dick, what can you tell us about these recordings?
These are tapes made in the 60s, 70s, and maybe a little bit of the 80s on reel-to-reel tape. Maybe you've seen a picture of such a thing.
Right.
We've had to search around to get equipment and keep it in order ourselves, but that's the way people recorded stuff back then. And this is from the era of the audiolingual method. And maybe some people have heard of that. It's a way of teaching language that we don't do anymore, but it was a product of its time, really. And those times were after the war in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, really, as I said, that was under the sway of ideas of behaviorism, that people learn things by simply by repetition, and not so much about the communicative or identity features of language and use in language learning. So that material comes out looking kind of really old-fashioned and to some people kind of senseless back then, and that's why there hasn't been that much attention to preserving this material. And I think we're one of the few places in the world that has an organized set of materials from those, of language teaching materials from those years, and that's why I was concerned about preserving it.
Sure.
A lot of people may not know what the audiolingual method was. But the idea was, as I said, that people learn through repetition, not so much by making things make sense so much. So I have a couple of examples, say, from a Russian course that still use some. Here was an example of of two lines that the students would repeat. Is that a pen or a pencil? Is that a glass or a cup? Well, where are you when we say that?
Right. What's the context?
Yeah, we don't know. A pen or pencil, glass or cup? Are we at the table? Are we at a desk? Are we even anybody? What's going on here? And here's some other examples from an English series of the time. So you would just repeat these. We didn't ask them to walk. We didn't ask them to work. We didn't ask him to attend the concert. Did you want them to walk? No, I didn't want them to walk. So the teacher might say the first sentence, and the student would be asked to give the negative response. Did you want them to work? No, I didn't want them to work. Did you want him to attend the concert? No, I didn't want him to attend the concert. So here we would call these focus on form, not focus on meaning.
Right.
And in modern times in language teaching, we think that focus on form, attention to the grammar, the pronunciation, and so forth of language should be done in a meaning context.
Right.
So, for example, I was just looking at some similar forms in a modern book. So you might take the students and say, well, let's say you're at a restaurant for breakfast, and you might include some other forms, some other functional language is another thing. Or what do you think would happen when you sit down at a breakfast table in a restaurant?
Right.
You might look at the menu. So the teacher might have a menu. You would look over some of the vocabulary. You would talk about some of the words, and the students would check up on the pronunciation of the words. And then here comes the waiter or waitress, and you see that there are 2 possible drinks offered, and the waitress says, "Would you like coffee or tea?" So that's actually in English a subtle and special kind of intonation pattern where you have alternatives like that. But we would introduce all that in a, as I say, in a meaning context. And would you like eggs or pancakes?
Right.
Can you hear how the intonation is going there?
Right.
Da 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 da.
Yeah.
So there's a rise on the one alternative, and then a fall at the end of the sentence. So there is stuff to learn there, but a kind of insistence on the form. You have to get that right. No, that's not it. Repeat after me. We don't need to do that much either because, what's so terrible about if somebody says, "Would you like coffee or tea?" as opposed to, "Would you like coffee or tea?" The point gets across.
Sure.
And whereas that might be our teaching point for that moment, that intonation pattern. Preserving the sense of communication, of reality, of the context is more important. The sense that the student actually can communicate stuff and can understand that all those features are more important than immediately getting that just right. And there might be homework and other things that would reinforce it, that help the student move toward more accuracy. But in class, we don't just drill the form point with no regard for meaning and no tolerance for error like that. So that's some important differences that have happened in language teaching over the last 40 years.
But would you say this audiolingual approach, would you say that's is that still a part of what we do now in teaching at all? I mean, when you talk about this context and meaning, is that not adding on to a potential drill? And we certainly see drills and a focus on form to some degree.
Yes. I think it's the jumping around with absolutely no context that we really don't do anymore.
And that's what's the substance of a lot of these reels. Is
Some of them are, where it's really about the form itself and without much attention to meaning. I mean, the assumption is that students understand still what they're saying, but they have to kind of jump around. So he wants to learn to dance well.
Mm-hmm.
She, and the student has to say, she wants to learn to dance well. I want to learn to dance well. So, students did learn language, the fact is,
sure,
from this kind of drill. A lot of students did learn, and a lot of students with our modern methods still find it difficult and sometimes unsuccessful.
Mm.
So we can't say that we've solved every language teaching problem, but we do think that an attention to meaning and context and identity are important in language learning. At the same time, this was legitimate, real social historical practice of its time, and I'm glad we've arranged for these materials to be preserved.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk about how they are being preserved. Our initial approach was to see what material was deemed valuable. Mostly that was a judgment call on your part, and I'm sure it's very difficult to determine what it's very difficult to figure out what's on all these reels without listening to every single one of them. There's a lot of stuff buried in there.
Absolutely. And I was struggling making distinctions. Should we just preserve material created at Cornell?
Right.
Should we throw out other stuff, even though these may be the only available copies of a lot of those materials from that era?
Right.
So in talking with the Cornell Library, they agreed with me that this was reasonable and legitimate intellectual material produced according to norms of the time and representing teaching and intellectual practice of the time, and just for those reasons should be preserved, even though we wouldn't teach language exactly that way now.
Right.
But as you say, even though, as you say, some of the ideas of drill and dialogue that were introduced then and were unknown before then, it should be said, continue today. So there isn't a complete break. There's a continuity of development from those times until today, and that's another reason why they should be preserved.
I wonder what sort of person or what sort of interest would be asking about a particular title or a particular reel. Can you think of?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, though. Of course, if you start looking into what libraries do, you might have difficulty deciding exactly who's going to look at a lot of that stuff.
Yeah, of course.
So I would think it would be a graduate student who's interested in the history of language teaching, and who is studying the development of these ideas. Where did the practice of modeling and then repeating dialogues come from? And what does a drill mean? So you might want to go back to where did this first come from? What are the different types there have been over the years? So I think it would be graduate students or researchers who want to look into the history and development of this kind of educational practice.
Right. I mean, I guess in a way it's sort of there's a museum aspect to this as well, just the idea of having a place where someone can kind of browse a few titles. Do you think that's going to be a possibility, that somebody could go to a web page and just sort of see what's available in some way?
Yes, I hope so. And I plan to work with the library some to help them present it in a way that would be attractive and informative to people and maybe help develop somebody's interest in this era. What's the difference between a museum and a library?
Right.
It's a subtle thing, really. So I think this really belongs in a library in that it's something that somebody might want to study and learn about and do research on to understand better.
Yeah.
So these materials are going to be preserved from this tradition of language teaching that's kind of has a special history here at Cornell, and I'm very pleased at that.
Yeah, it's great news. I'll admit I was a little bit doubtful on the outcome of this project. I just wasn't sure what we were going to do. I kind of thought we'd end up with a storeroom filled with boxes again that we just kind of let sit for a while. So this solution is kind of a dream come true, really.
Yes. Well, I had looked all around the country. I'd asked major national organizations about it, and everybody kind of thought it was a good idea, but they didn't want to do it, maintain an archive of this sort of thing. So it makes sense that it's our own local, very large and well-enabled Cornell Library that is taking the reins here and preserving it, since a lot of it, a good share of what we have is in fact Cornell faculty-produced material. Teachers can produce materials that are useful to their students. This is teacher-produced stuff. You don't have to wait for some big institution to do it, even though it is a commitment on the part of a teacher, but it's a way of focusing their own work and really delivering the best experience and up-to-date experience to their students.
The Language Resource Center is located on the ground floor of Stimson Hall on Cornell's main campus in Ithaca, New York. Check us out on the web at lrc.cornell.edu or look for Cornell LRC on Facebook and Twitter. Speaking of Language is produced by Sam Lupowitz and Dan Gable. Recorded by Sam Lupowitz. Original music by Sam Lupowitz, Dan Gable, and Joe Gibson.